the basic split for most of the 19th century was between the popular poets and the ones that are recognized today, but were not recognized at the time. So on the one hand, we have those that you did a month or two ago: Longfellow, Whittier, Holmes, Emerson, who kind of stands out as a critical as well as popular favorite. And on the other hand, we have Whitman and Dickinson. Possibly, arguably, I think so, the most gifted and the greatest American poets. Not necessarily, especially in Whitman's case, the most moral, the most Christian, the one whose message to listen to the most, but certainly the great modern poets that had a lot to do with what has happened with poetry since. In Whitman's case, free verse, as I've mentioned, he was a master of free verse, something that is very difficult to do well. If you rhyme and you follow standard poetic rules like having metaphors and alliteration and assonance and similes, it's going to seem like a poem. It's going to be poem-like. It's a lot harder to not follow the rules and to write poetry that actually is any good, that is not, as so much apparent so-called free verse is, just prose trying to look like poetry or calling itself poetry. Dickinson was different. You read her poems, you can see that they have rhyme and rhythm. In fact, they have a very basic, simple rhyme and rhythm, which actually comes from hymn meter, the same meter that we saw in the Bay Psalm book, where there were hymns that were meant to be sung in church, generally either 8 syllables or 6 syllables a line. A lot of the great old hymns, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee, etc. If you know that one from the 18th century, that has 7 syllables a line. That's also common, but Emily Dickinson tended to go with the 8 and or 6 syllables a line. A lot of our Christmas carols do that. It came upon a midnight clear, that glorious song of old. As you'll see, we see that in Emily Dickinson a lot. Her poems rhyme. Her poems look, on the surface, pretty easy to understand. They don't look very complicated. Lots of basic familiar facts about Emily Dickinson. For example, she wrote almost 2,000 poems, about 1,770, I think, and only a few were published during her lifetime. Like other poets that we've looked at, Anne Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, her poems were basically published after her death. I imagine her up in her room with piles of poems piling up on her shelves, being found after her death, although I have no real way of knowing. As the book mentions, she did not actually title her poems. They're often listed simply by number, so that a title like "This is my letter to the world" or "Because I could not stop for death" that's popularly given to one of her poems is simply the first line of the poem, and thus a way people can remember it. Some of the things that they say in the book are not quite right. She did not isolate herself and dress only in white, etc. After she went to school. It was not really until her father died and she was not as involved with her family that she really lived a hermit life, sitting alone in her room writing her poems, that people often connect with Emily Dickinson. Living this isolated life in the small town of Amherst, Massachusetts, hardly leaving it except for the one great adventure where she went to Washington with her father, who had been elected to Congress, and met a married man whom she would not behave immorally with. Living this isolated life, as I say, did not prevent Dickinson from being able to write great poetry. That's an argument people could make, and which I will put into the discussion board. Does someone need to have a wide experience of life, as some authors say, to really be able to do good writing? Or could that person simply live like Emily Dickinson did, a very simple life, seeing just her family, friends, going to church, going around a small town, and be able to do good writing? Which poems do you think, looking over them, are the ones that are day-to-day observation ones? I would say A Bird Came Down the Walk, The Day Came Slow Till 5 o'clock, and Apparently With No Surprise. These are poems that make me think of Emily Dickinson looking out her window, watching the sunrise, watching the frost in the winter, out in her garden, actually seeing a bird. That's one of her best known poems, and certainly has amazingly strong and precise ability to describe what she sees. We'll look at the other two types of poems in the next part, but one of them certainly would be poems of faith and immortality, as our book mentions, or I should say faith in immortality. The poem about the abdication of belief. Abdication means giving up something, like a king giving up his title. So what she was really writing is that someone who forsakes God, as one person put it, narrows his horizons. And certainly she went back and forth all the time, as I hope the PowerPoint showed. Her brother and sister converted and joined churches, but Emily Dickinson did not do that, even though early in life she wrote, "I felt I had found my Savior. I never enjoyed such perfect peace and happiness. I feel that I shall never be happy without I love Christ." Phrased in the 19th century way there, but you can see what she's getting at. And yet she did not attend evangelical meetings. She was afraid of being hypocritical. She did attend church, and as I pointed out, hymn meter are in her verse, as well as the language of sermons. There were revivals in Amherst throughout the 1840s, but Emily avoided them. Eventually, I think she did believe in God. Sometimes she felt like God was hiding from her. In one poem, she said she was knocking everywhere to find Jesus' chamber. She wrote one poem about the disciple Thomas, appropriately, the doubting one. But she wanted to believe in immortality, and I do believe that in the end, as that deathbed note shows, and as some of her poems in our book shows, she did finally believe in that. Whether she came close enough to God to achieve it, of course, is something that we can't say. A few final points about Emily Dickinson's life. Her father, a respected lawyer, as I said, finally a congressman. She was very fond of her brother Austin and her sister Lavinia, and her closeness with her nieces and nephews, where she was a nice aunt to them, almost a secondary mother role, was one thing that kept Emily Dickinson from being the hermit that she's pictured as. Had she been totally involved in her duties as hostess and housekeeper, like many middle-class families of those days, they had visitors constantly, visitors who would stay the night. Possibly she would not have been able to write so many poems. In later life, Emily did become the hermit that she is pictured as, retreating in perhaps her last 20 years. Her father died, her mother became paralyzed by a stroke, a nephew of hers died. She had a lot of trouble getting over these events. And after 1879, according to the biographer, she never once left the house. Some of her themes are anxiety, loneliness, suffering. We can see these in some of the poems that we'll look at later on. Fame, and certainly she also wrote poems about her audience and about perhaps her secret wish to achieve fame, which was hidden under her apparent desire not to have her poems published. We will be looking at the individual poems in our book in parts 2 and 3, but we are finished examining the life and general characteristics of Emily Dickinson.